Bonjour, mon nom est Hugues Leblanc. Je vais dédié aux conférences Hugues Leblanc édition 2024. Cette série annuelle de conférences honore la mémoire de Hugues Leblanc, qui est un grand logicien originaire du Québec. Et cet événement se déroule traditionnellement sur 2 jours, pendant lesquels nous avons la chance d'entendre 3 conférences d'un conférencier réputé sur le plan international, un sujet d'intérêt commun. Parmi les nombreux participants qui nous ont fait l'honneur de venir parmi nous pour les conférences du Leblanc, vous les avez là en résumé. On voit des gens comme Raymond, Bas van Strassen, Robert Brandon, Hugues Leblanc, Claude Palachot, etc.
So je suis Christophe Balader, je m'appelle Christophe Balader, mais je vais faire le deep L, traducteur, traduire tout ce que dit Dominique plus ou moins fidèlement. I'm also the co-organizer of this conference series, this 2024 Hugues Leblanc lectures. So these annual lectures celebrate the memory of the québécois logician philosopher Hugues Leblanc. They work over 2 days. The event is structured around a series of presentations by an internationally renowned speaker on a theme somehow related to analytic philosophy. In the past, we've had the chance really to welcome many well-renowned philosophers, some of whom have their posters here on the wall.
Donc, l'invité de Leblanc 2024 est Simon Caney, dont les travaux reconnus internationalement portent sur la justice climatique. Comme vous le savez, les peuples autochtones d'ici et de partout dans le monde sont parmi les premiers affectés par la crise climatique. Et donc, il me semble particulièrement important de commencer ce cycle de conférences en soulignant que les terres sur lesquelles nous nous trouvons font partie d'un territoire ancestral qui a longtemps servi de lieu de vie, de rencontre et d'échange entre les peuples autochtones, notamment la nation canadienne Moran. Nous honorons, respectons et reconnaissons ces nations qui n'ont jamais cédé leurs droits ni leur autorité souveraine sur les terres et les eaux sur lesquelles nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui.
So our guest lecturer this year is Professor Simon Caney, whose internationally acclaimed work focuses on climate justice. And so, as you know, Indigenous peoples here and elsewhere in the world are particularly affected by the climate crisis. And in this context, it seems particularly important and relevant to begin this lecture series by emphasizing that the lands on which we stand are part of the international territory that has long served as a place for life, encounters, and exchanges in Indigenous peoples, notably the Canadian Nation or Mohawk Nation. And we honor, respect, and recognize these nations who have never ceded their rights or sovereign authority over the lands and waters on which we gather today.
Alors, Simon Caney, professeur de théorie politique à l'université Warwick, au Royaume-Uni. Il a enseigné à l'université de Newcastle et à l'université de Birmingham. Avant d'occuper son poste actuel, il était professeur de théorie politique à l'université d'Oxford et chargé de cours en politique au Magdalen College. Il travaille sur les questions de philosophie politique contemporaine et se concentre en particulier sur les questions de justice globale, environnementale et intergénérationnelle. Il a publié de nombreux ouvrages sur la justice climatique, la démocratie, le cosmopolitisme et les responsabilités envers les générations futures. Donc, il est l'auteur de Justice Beyond Borders, The Global Political Theory, publié à Oxford University Press en 2005. Et il est également coéditeur avec Stephen Gardiner, Dale Jamieson et Henry Shue de Climate Ethics, publié en 2010 à Oxford University Press.
Okay, so Simon Caney is a professor. Let me repeat that in a different language. Next time I'll do it in Latin. Simon Caney is a professor in political theory at the University of Warwick. He's taught at Newcastle and Birmingham. Prior to this, he was professor of political theory at Oxford and also fellow tutor in politics at Magdalen College. So he works, as you've understood, in contemporary political philosophy. He focuses in particular on issues of global, environmental, and intergenerational justice. He's published widely in climate justice, and this is why we have him today here, on global justice, on cosmopolitanism, on equality, democracy, and responsibilities to future generations. Just us here, but what's coming down the line. Right? So he's the author. I'm not including Justice Beyond Borders at Oxford, and he's also co-editor with Gardiner, Jameson, and Shu of Climate Ethics.
Donc, il n'a pas fait simplement que des activités de philosophe en nombre. Il a également rédigé des documents d'information et des rapports sur certaines des questions liées au changement climatique pour des organisations telles que Oxfam, la Banque mondiale, le Mary Robinson Foundation et le Conseil international pour l'étude des droits de l'homme. Il a été également membre du Nuffield Council on Bioethics du Royaume-Uni et il est co-auteur des rapports du Nuffield Council of Bioethics sur les biocarburants, Ethical Issues de 2011 et Research in Global Health Emergencies de 2020. Il termine actuellement 2 livres, On Cosmopolitanism, Equality, Ecology and Emancipation à Oxford University Press, et puis Democracy, Justice and the Future, an essay in applied political philosophy.
So Simon Caney is not, solely working on academic papers and book, but he's also worked on more engaged work, working on background papers and reports on ethical issues surrounding climate change for organizations such as Oxfam, the World Bank, the Mary Robinson Foundation, and the International Council on Human Rights Policy. He was also a member of Nuffield Council of Bioethics in the UK, and co-author of reports on biofuels and on global health emergencies. And now he's just completing 2 books that we're looking forward to see in print. One on cosmopolitanism.
3 fois rapidement.
Accent, that's always the wrong place.
Yes.
And another one on democracy, justice, and the future.
Très bien. Alors, le programme de l'après-midi. Comme par les années passées, donc les Hugues Leblanc se déroulent sur 2 jours, cet après-midi et demain toute la journée. Alors, chaque conférence d'une durée d'environ 50 minutes sera suivie d'un commentaire d'environ 15 minutes auquel nous demanderons à Simon Caney de réagir brièvement. Le tout sera suivi d'une période de questions, les plus intéressantes les unes que les autres, j'en suis sûre. Le programme des 3 conférences est disponible sur le site Internet du département de philosophie. Cet après-midi, nous avons donc une première conférence dont le titre est « What kind of climate duties do we have to future generations ?» Et c'est notre collègue Éric Pinault du département de sociologie ici à l'UQAM et membre de l'Institut des sciences de l'environnement qui fera le premier.
Okay, so as in previous years, the Leblanc series lectures will take place over 2 days, this afternoon and tomorrow, nearly all day. Each lecture will last about 15 minutes and will be followed by a commentary lasting about 15 minutes, to which Simon Caney will then respond briefly, and this will be followed by a Q&A session. All in all, the presentations, comments, and Q&A should not exceed about 2 hours, and once this is completed, we will all have refreshments at the Espace Philo.
Oui, c'est le bout que j'avais oublié. Il y aura des rafraîchissements, période de questions.
I noticed that.
Dans l'espace philo.
Alors, so this afternoon, we have our first lecture, what kind of climate duties we have to future generations, and our colleague Éric Pinault from the sociology department at UQAM will then do a commentary.
Okay. Alors, un dernier mot avant de passer la parole à Simon Caney. Alors, un événement comme les conférences Hugues Leblanc, ça ne se fait pas tout seul. Et en fait, ça ne serait pas possible sans l'appui logistique et financier d'un grand nombre de partenaires. Donc, il nous faut remercier chaleureusement à l'UQAM, le département de philosophie, la chaire de recherche du Canada en philosophie de la vie, dont le titulaire est bien sûr Christophe Malater, la faculté des sciences humaines et l'Institut des sciences de l'environnement. J'aimerais également remercier le Centre de recherche en éthique de Caney. Nous avons le plaisir de compter avec nous cet après-midi, qui en est la co-directrice. Le Centre interuniversitaire de recherche sur la science et la technologie, le CIRST, et le groupe de recherche interuniversitaire en philosophie politique, dont Mathias Rich et moi sommes membres. Voilà. Donc, nous les remercions tous pour leur appui substantiel dans l'organisation.
So, final word before handing it over to Simon Caney. An event like this lectures would not be possible without financial support and logistical support from a large number of partners. Or our warmest thanks go to UQAM's Department of Philosophy, the Canada Research Chair in Philosophy of the Life Sciences, the Faculty of Humanities at UQAM, and the Institute of Environmental Sciences at UQAM, as well as the Center for Research and Ethics, the CRAE, the University Research Group in Political Philosophy, and the Inter-University Research Center on Science and Technology.
Voilà. Ouf.
Let's turn it over to Simon Caney.
Lovely. Thank you very much, both of you, for the invitation and for organising it. Thank you for those bodies listed earlier for enabling it, and thank you. Everyone who's attending. I'm very flattered and honoured to be here. I'm going to get straight down to business, and there are 3 lectures, and they do fit together as a sequence, but I'm not assuming that everyone's going to turn at them. But you may have questions or queries, and my true gambit will be say I pick that up in lecture 2 or 3. Okay. Failing at
Oh.
basically. Yeah, so I wanted to begin with this question of what kind of climate duties do we have to future generations? And to pose that question, well, we're saying it's a question of intergenerational justice. And the first thing I want to emphasize is it's affecting people right now. We have global mean temperatures more than 1 degree higher than pre-industrial time. We can see the effects reported in the news in terms of wildfires as well. So it is an issue of justice to current generations, but it is also an issue of justice to those who are going to be born in the future, or children who are going to live longer than myself. And I want to begin by just emphasizing why it's an issue of justice to future generations. So the first is that the emission of greenhouse gases, if you emit a ton of carbon, a lot of that is going to stay in the atmosphere for 100 years and then 1,000 years, and some of it for further. And so it just has long-term effects, and we cannot bracket out those long-term effects. The second is that there's often carbon lock-in, by which, I mean, if you build towns and cities in certain ways, then that will lock in the way that people go about. They use cars, whether there's public transport. So the decisions made now in terms of infrastructure, buildings, energy systems have a huge kind of temporal effect. In fact, one of the IPCC reports said that many of the emissions from about like 10 years ago were still being shaped by infrastructure constructed after World War II. So these decisions should affect the way we're designing towns and cities right now, because whether future people will be able to decarbonize or whether we're locking them into unsustainable practices is a function of right now. And then the third reason is that some of the policy responses have long-term impacts. And the most obvious example of this is if people decide to use nuclear energy, because the temporal range of the impacts of nuclear energy are just enormous, in thousands of years. So we cannot just treat it as a question of justice to contemporaries. So that's the question. I immediately put this as a kind of underneath bit, which to say there are loads of other questions of what we owe to the future. I'm not saying that climate is the only one. Biodiversity loss is hugely significant. Other planetary boundaries, antimicrobial resistance. You can read them all. So that's just to make clear that this is not the only major issue of intergenerational justice. So I thought the way that I'd like to answer this question about what kind of climate duties we have to future generations would be to really break it down into 3 questions. And the first one is really to identify what are the fundamental philosophical principles that guide our thinking. And the second part is in a way concerned with how we should think about concepts like people being better off or standard of living. If we say we should leave future generations with a decent standard of living, the obvious question to ask is, well, how are you defining standard of living? And that's what part 2 looks at, including this kind of fraught debate that many often have with, does it mean that we should abandon economic growth? Does it mean that we should pursue economic growth? And I think there's a big empirical element to that question, but there's something that I think philosophers can add. So that's what I'm going to do for part 2. And then part 3 links actually to one of the books mentioned about designing institutions to cope with the future. I think one thing we owe future generations is to rethink the way we design institutions, political institutions. They are not well designed for dealing with climate change. How might we redesign these institutions to make them more likely to comply with the principles of justice for future generations? So that's the roadmap. So let's start with, what does one generation owe to future generations? And I think probably the most common answer given in public discourse is the one from the Brundtland Commission from 1987. In fact, yesterday, sometime between yesterday and today, somewhere late at night, I Googled and looked at Canadian pronouncements of it, and I think the Canadian Ministry for the Environment says sustainable development is this. Certainly in the UK, the Welsh government, which is more ambitious when it comes to climate goals than other parts, it features there. And I think it was a very significant intervention. In philosophical terms, what it is, it affirms the sufficientarian standard. It says what we owe future generations is to ensure that all people who live in the future are above a certain minimum standard of living. So I think it was a very good thing to put forward. I'm pleased that lots of institutions endorse it, but I also think it's too weak. And the reason is because of what I put in blue, to meet their own needs. Now, no matter how expansive you define needs, that seems to me problematic, because it would say that this generation could have extravagantly good lives as long as people in the future are above a certain threshold. So it tolerates some kind of intergenerational inequality, where some people have worse lives just because they're born in the future. So I wonder, why only meeting needs? Why not something more ambitious than that? Why should someone born in 2300, as a matter of justice, be only entitled to having their needs met, but someone born now, people might think, is entitled to more? So I think it's necessary to have that standard, but it seems to me insufficient. Now, given what I've just said, someone might think, okay, we should have a second view, which is, we should try and ensure that future people have an equal standard of living to current generations, that they go from sufficiency to equality. And that would overcome the problem I just mentioned. But it's open to a really obvious kind of objection pointed out, maybe not pointed out, but Parfit made a lot of this point, which is it would tolerate levelling down. So one way to think about this for the intergenerational context is to think of things like technological innovation. And I looked at the history of technological innovations. Lots of them, they produce benefits in the short run. The bulk of the benefits come considerably later, when societies get used to how to employ them and get the best out of them. So what we'd have to think in this case is future generations can be equally well off as us, but not better off, right? Because this is equality. We would have to stop the flow of benefits, if there were any, and prevent future people benefiting. And that just seems extremely implausible, as people like Parfit pointed out. So I don't think we should level down in those cases. I mean, imagine if at the beginning of the 20th century, someone said, we should leave future generations no better off than at the beginning of the 20th century. Would that be an attractive view? So then, if you think that, if you're persuaded by what I just said, there's a third view that says, okay, so what we should do is leave future generations at least as well off as the current generation. They shouldn't be worse off, but they can be better off. And I quote a lot of people who say this because I was struck by how many people from different disciplines came up with a similar view. The earliest, I think, was Brian Barry, the political philosopher. So those alive at any time are custodians rather than owners of the planet, which I think is a really attractive way of thinking about it. And ought to pass it on at least no worse shape than they found it in. So he says it would be nice if it be better off, but it was no obligation to. And Edith Brown Weiss, who is an international lawyer, wrote a seminal book on fairness to future generations, has a similar formulation. The Nobel laureate in economics, Robert Solow, says we should have leave future people a standard of living at least as good as our own. So you can see there's a plethora of formulations that essentially say it's not about sufficiency, it's not about insisting on equality over time, it's a view that has two aspects. It says future people should be no worse off than current ones, and then secondly, but they can be better off. So it avoids the leveling down objection. And I think there is something right about this, but it's not quite right. So let me say what bothers me about this. So one thing that bothers me is the baseline being employed. People often say we should leave the world no worse off than the way we found it. That's something that Brian Barry's formulated. It follows we should leave future people a standard of living at least as good as our own. And so question number one is, who is the we or the our in these? And so if it's a contemporary citizen of the US, US citizen, I think that's unattainable because it's not possible to leave the world with that level of consumption of resources and ensure that future people can have that. It's just, that's overshoot. But one might think, okay, well, maybe many citizens of the world going by their standard and think, oh, cool, we can just replicate that for the future. These overshoots. Someone might say, well, let's go for a developing country. Let's go for one of the poorest countries in the world. Democratic Republic of the Congo. But that would be just way too low. We say we can't leave people in the future better off than current inhabitants of the DRC. And I think this is a flaw with any descriptive baseline, because we have to know, A, why we would choose that one, and B, they just seem capricious and arbitrary. What we should have, I think, is what I'm going to call a moralized baseline. So one guided by some moral criteria that I'll come to in a minute. So one thing I think is really unsatisfactory is when people say, yeah, we should leave them as well off as us. I'd like to know, well, who is the us and why you're using that? The second thing is, it just seems curmudgeonly, to not a philosophical idiom, to say we may leave them better off, but we don't have to. I mean, under certain conditions, it seems really plausible to say we ought to leave them better off. People like John Roma, Chris Bennett, Léon Bourgeois, the French radical politician, by which I mean he was a member of the Radical Party, and philosopher in his book Solidarity, that each generation, inherits benefits from the past, and as a matter of intergenerational solidarity, it should pass on those benefits, but more if it can. And I just think if the benefits are great enough, that seems like a really powerful argument. If you could leave people in the future better able to cope or not vulnerable to diseases, then why would you not think that you ought to, you have a duty to do that? So that's reason number two. Reason number three is most of these formulations operate in a very homogeneous way. They say current generation could be future generation, like let's say no worse off, and they think of it in vertical terms. So there's the future people and there's the current people, and they want to know how that block there. But that seems too narrow, because I think we should have a horizontal view. So unpack that future generation and think, well, we have a duty not to contribute to creating unequal societies, or not to creating polarized societies, or stratified societies. Because the decisions made at one point often shape whether the future societies are divided or unequal, stratified or riven with conflict. So let's just put that together. I think that basically I'm going to suggest we think of current generations who promote their own standard of living up to a standard of living as long as they can ensure that that leaves future generations no worse off than them. That's the baseline. It's not, we're going to pick the standard of living of an average New York citizen or an average member of Portugal or wherever. We can say people are entitled to a standard of living now, as long as we can ensure that future ones have like reasonable prospects. You can't guarantee things in life, reasonable prospects, but nothing worse than that. And that does mean, just to make this very clear, that means a lot of people are way above level S, right? And in terms of their consumption of resources and the use of the Earth's atmosphere, they're way off, they're way over that. That's the first principle. And then the second principle says, there are conditions under which we have a duty to bequeath a better world. And then the third one says, we also have duty to bequeath a fairer or juster world. It's just not good enough to say, oh, we can leave things no worse off. Whereas we could create a world where there's less racism or less harassment or less cruelty, discrimination. And obviously, those are important goals that ought to be realised. So that's why that third one is in there. Now, I think this is true for any policy area, right? So whether you're talking about how to deal with the challenges of AI or antimicrobial resistance or whatever, but let me feed you to some implications for climate. So if you had this ethical compass, I think there's various conclusions you'd reach. One is that dangerous climate change is severely unjust in at least two ways. One is vertically. It completely undermines the possibility of leaving people in the future no worse off. And the second is horizontally. The impacts of climate change are felt disproportionately on the poorest and most vulnerable. Because of their poverty and vulnerability, they live in areas that are more susceptible to the damages. And this just further reinforces and re-entrenches inequality. So it's not just that it has harmful effects en masse, but it actually exacerbates tensions and inequality. So what would this mean concretely for thinking about policy? I think there are at least 4 implications that one might draw from this. So think about when people talk about climate policy, they often talk about a target. It used to be, oh, we should get the world beneath the 2-degree barrier. So temperature should not exceed an increase of more than 2 degrees over pre-industrial times. But then because various countries, I think small island states in particular, campaigned for it to be something closer to 1.5. You've got the Paris Agreement, which said we shouldn't allow the world temperature to exceed 2 degrees. It must be well below 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5 possible. That's the Paris Agreement. What I think those principles would tell us is how to think about what is the appropriate target there, because often they are presented as this is what the science tells us. But climate scientists always say in discussions with me and other people, this is a value judgment. And I think my principles will therefore inform what the appropriate target should be. And it will be something as close as possible to 1.5, if not lower, if that's possible in the future. The second implication they would have is for things like the greenhouse gas budget. So if you read reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you'll see they say, oh, humanity's got X amount of greenhouse gases it can emit. And then it adds, if you want an X% probability, so sometimes it's 66%, sometimes it's 50%, sometimes it's even lower than that. If you want an X probability of an X kind of world, Y kind of world, a world beneath 2 degrees, this is how many greenhouse gases you can emit. So there are 2 variables there. One is what's your attitude towards risk, and the other is do you think handing over a 2-degree world is a fair offer to the next generation or not. And the point I want to make here is, I don't think you can answer these questions without having an account of what we owe the future. And so the principles I've given earlier would be my way of thinking about what should the budget be? Because you just cannot decide it without having normative criteria about what the level of risk it's fair to expose people to, and whether you think 2 degrees is fair, or 1.5, or some other goal. Third kind of implication it would have is it should inform whether you engage in things like wanting to use nuclear energy or not, because as I said earlier, that has a huge kind of impact. In my view, it gives you good reason to try and not use nuclear, use other energy sources or reduce consumption. And then the fourth thing you would have is how you think about distributing the costs of dealing with climate change over time. And the reason I include this is, A, it's true, but some proposals people make, it's always a good reason for saying something if it's true, but there's another reason. So some people like John Broome, who's an IPCC author and White's professor of moral philosophy at Oxford, have said, look, the most important thing to do is to prevent climate change, and then we can pass on the costs to future people. He doesn't think that's a fair way of treating the future people, but it's needed to effectively deal with the problem. This fourth one would condemn that kind of approach in a way, because it says whether that's equitable or not, we have to be guided by those principles I gave. And I think it's very unlikely that they could be as well off as our generation if we said, yeah, we're going to have had a very carbon intensive lifestyle and quite high standard of living, and we're not going to do it anymore, but we're going to compensate ourselves for the hardship of giving it up and pass it on to them. I will talk a bit more about John's argument in lecture 2. So because the first bit was quite philosophical, looking at these principles, I wanted to add this bit to say how this would matter. It would say you can't answer these questions without having some ethical compass. I've given you my one. Not really what it means in practice, because I don't know what you would really mean in practice to work it out. You need far more empirical knowledge than I put down there. Okay, so me when 15 is up. First, we should do things like leave future generations no worse off than if it leaves them better off. But an obvious question to ask there is, well, better off in terms of what? No worse off in terms of what? Equally well off. What is the metric that you're using to define those terms? What are the standards being employed? And answers might be, oh, look, happiness, that we should think about leaving people no worse off. Or it might be the command over economic resources and wealth. So I think you can't just leave what I've said there without saying something about what metric we should use there. And in particular, I want to look at this idea that we should think of better off and worse off in terms of command over wealth, because there's quite a heated debate amongst environmentalists and others and amongst economists on does this require something like green growth, so pursuing growth as a goal, but decarbonising it and decoupling, as people often say, the economy from the use of natural resources, or is just a mirage, and should we pursue something like degrowth? That's how I'm going to enter into this discussion. I mean, many economists are in favour, or orthodox economists are in favour of green growth. Degrowth may be less familiar to some people here, maybe, but you know, there are people like Serge Latouche, the French economist, who pioneered, I think, to some extent, this emphasis on degrowth, or André Gortz, talked about degrowth in the middle of the 1970s. The British thinker Tim Jackson and Georgios Kallis, who I think is based in Barcelona, along with some colleagues, has written a book there. He's written some other books on degrowth. So we do need an answer to this question: how are we going to think about the standards? And it's important to intervene in this debate about should it be growth or degrowth. I should say, I'm not sure if I put this on the PowerPoint somewhere, but I think to a large extent it's an empirical thing, right? And I'm very skeptical of philosophers from the armchair saying, well, it just seems to me that, and then something comes forward about green growth is entirely possible or it's an absolute mirage. But I do think philosophers can contribute something in trying to explore the terms being used, because I think there's often quite a lot of slippage. And I want to persuade you that I think there's a false choice going on in this debate. So people often say, are you in favour of economic growth? Are you in favour of degrowth? And I think there's a third view, which others have put forward as well, that seems to be more plausible. And the deep problem, it seems to me, with this debate is that both sides are centering something, growth, economic growth, that pretty much everyone agrees is not in itself fundamentally important. So by economic growth, I mean GDP growth, and that's really important. So when people called for economic growth, I think they rarely ever, I've never really come across anyone who said it's important in and of itself. It's important because and to the extent that it produces certain benefits for people. So in very practical terms, it might be like heating and lighting and transport. It might be housing and being able to get around. But there's always some other goal which it serves, and the service might be serving something like happiness or preference satisfaction or something else. So even the most ardent enthusiasts for economic growth think its value is derivative. And so do the critics, right? The critics think, amongst other things, that it just doesn't track something valuable in and of itself. But then I think, well, it's a bit puzzling to put this thing that you don't think we should care about at centre stage. Shouldn't we really think, how should we think about quality of life? How should we think about the standard of living? Put that one centre stage and then explore the environmental implications of that. Now, that's, I think, true, but it kind of then invites a problem, which is someone might say, okay, what is your account of what we should put in this category? How should we define quality of life or standard of living? All within like 15 minutes in a lecture. So I'm not going to try and do that, but I'm just going to align myself, I suppose, with the view that Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen take. But anything I say doesn't really depend on my particular view on it. Because some people might say, look, the answer is to do with happiness, and that's the goal we should really be pursuing. The view from people like Nussbaum and Sen is that we should think of standard of living in terms of realizing certain capabilities to function in a way. And Sen is famously unwilling to specify what these are, but Nussbaum, as many of you may know, comes up with lists of these capabilities, and hers is much more really articulated, and I can really do justice for it here, but she wants to say, look, we care about things like life, meaning as a normal human life. So things go bad for someone if their life is cut short. Number two, people need food and they need protection from the elements, they need protection from disease or non-exposure from disease. Number three, people need control and choice over their body and how to use their body, and physical safety and freedom of movement. So for each of these, she unpacks it more than I wanted to try and do on a PowerPoint. You don't have to buy this by any time, but it's just how I'm thinking about it. But the main point is growth has value if, because, and to the extent that there's some valuable human interest. Here's one account of them. And then the suggestion is breathtakingly simple. It just says, well, why don't we just orient the discussion not about something that doesn't fundamentally matter, but about things that do. And then if you do this, you're led to what people like Kate Raworth, the economist, call agnosticism about growth. which is in a sense to say, look, I think we should promote human flourishing. And I don't care what happens to economic growth, because it could go up, it could go down, it could stay the same. It's really not, doesn't have that fundamental relevance. And Jerome van der Berg calls it a growth. It's indifferentism to growth, not indifferent to any kind of growth, but economic growth in particular. Economic growth is just sort of an epiphenomenon, or it's a byproduct. So why don't we just orient the discussion around that and give up the debate about economic growth and degrowth? That's, put it in a slightly polemical way, what I'm saying. Now, people are not happy with this suggestion, and there's two reasons. So those in favour of economic growth say, look, but you do need economic growth, GDP growth, to promote human welfare. So if that concede, it's not really instrumentally valuable. It's nonetheless the case that it's necessary means to that end. But that's where we need empirical analysis. But for the record, my understanding of many economists over time, from John Stuart Mill and John Maynard Keynes onward, people think it's just not true that all the items that go under the heading of GDP are necessary for human well-being to go up. And it's also true that many of the things that contribute to human well-being don't hit a figure in GDP. It's been much more sensible to disaggregate economic growth and say, oh, we should promote those things which contribute to human well-being and flourishing, and exclude those things which don't, not treat it en bloc. When I refer to Mill, some of you may know I'm thinking about Mill's principles of political economy and his defense of what he calls the stationary state. In the 19th century, many people were worried that economic growth was coming to an end, and Mill said, well, don't worry about that. It was really important to overcome material obstacles to human flourishing, but once you reach a certain level, it becomes less and less important. John Maynard Keynes, in his The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, took a kind of a similar view. About something like the art of getting by versus the art of life. That might be Mill, but the gist was the same in both, which is there's decreasing importance of material goods the more wealthy you become. So the point is just, I don't think that's empirically plausible to say economic growth is necessary for promoting human welfare. And then sometimes people might resist my suggestion from the other side and say it's imperative to reduce economic growth to save the planet. And I think that sort of misstates the fundamental imperative. The fundamental imperative is to eliminate or reduce those activities that are causing environmental degradation. That's what people's minds should be focused on. Now, that might mean that economic growth goes down, but it might mean that it stays stable or it goes up. But it's not, that doesn't really matter. What really matters, causally speaking, in terms of securing what we owe to future generations, is minimizing the effect of having on the climate system and the environment more generally, so that they're not harmful. Now, I agree a lot with the critics of growth, and I think sometimes they should say something more mild, which is to say we should abandon economic growth as an objective, not the right objective for our society. And I think that seems to me very plausible, but it doesn't follow from that, and I don't think it's true to say, and we should aim for degrowth. No, aim for not harming the environment in the right ways, and then what happens to economic growth. It'd be interesting to see what happens to economic growth, but it's not really what matters. Okay, so just to summarize this bit, I thought here's a test of my view. Can we state what we owe to future generations in a comprehensive way without referring to the concept of economic growth or degrowth? And I think we can, because we just say, well, what we owe them is guided by these principles of leaving the world no worse off for future generations, bequeathing a better world if it's possible, and not bequeathing a divided and unequal world. And so that's the first bit in blue. And then the second bit, we talk about how we're going to get there without referring to economic growth or means to it, because the emphasis is always on reducing our ecological harmful effects. And we can say that without using those words, degrowth or non-growth. So I think they become superfluous. Now, there's like one big thing I want to say and then a small thing. So the big thing is, I think many degrowthers would probably agree with quite a lot of I think Callis et al., that book I cited, say they want to increase or improve human well-being over time, and they say we ought to disaggregate. They also say many other things under the heading of degrowth that I haven't discussed because I don't think they're really about reducing economic growth. They're about eliminating exploitation and having all other kinds of changes to modern society. So I don't want it to be seen as a rejection of what degrowthers are often arguing, much of what they say is untouched. But I do think it means that it's really unhelpful to frame it as calling for degrowth. And that leads to the small, maybe slightly trivial point is, I just think it's not a very inspiring ideal to say, what I'm going to offer you is degrowth, everyone. If I say, bequeathing you a better world or greater happiness or more well-being, I think that sounds inspiring to me. But saying, look, we've got to go downwards. It's not a good pitch. And on less superficial grounds, is what really often attracts a lot of heat and criticism. People often say, well, you're going to tell members of the working class that what they have to do is tighten their belts and worsen their standard of living. And I think the degrowthers will say, no, that's not what we mean. Not surprising some people will construe it that way. So this is not a full answer to the what should we use of the standard of living. I've just borrowed Nussbaum and Penn and defended their view, but I don't think anything I say depends on answering that to say we should not get bogged down in that kind of debate. Now, someone says, okay, look, can we just descend from the abstract philosophical theorizing and say, can you just tell us what this would actually mean? Then, these are the kinds of things that you might think are what's required by making the world no worse off and will be better off. It would mean things like a green industrial policy investing in renewables and upscaling provision of renewable energy. It would mean redesigning towns and cities so that they're not like these dispersed ones where everyone has to drive everywhere because they're more densely populated and there's public transport. It would mean technocratic things like improving building design so they're more energy efficient and just don't waste energy. It would mean I put where politically feasible for carbon taxes, because one thing that I think the last 20 years has shown is that it's really hard to get an effective carbon tax on the books. And it's not surprising. I mean, political scientists have worked on this quite a lot. It just comes with a big cost up front. Much easier to get people to agree to things like green industrial policy with a lot of investment in green jobs and infrastructure, rather than put the price up and the benefits will come later. You can see some of the other proposals there, like the campaigns for keeping fossil fuels on the ground, for example, protecting forests and other greenhouse gas sinks. So that's not supposed to be exhaustive, it's just supposed to be illustrative of the way that we might comply with the inclusions of the generation. Okay, now I want to turn to the third part. So the question is, what kind of climate duties do we owe to future generations? Part one was to say, here's some fundamental principles. Part two was to say something about the debate about economic growth and whether what we owe future generations is degrowth or green growth. And then part three is sort of animated by the following two thoughts. So thought number one is that political institutions are very reactive phenomena. They tend to react to current and past traumas and conflicts. So they're very not designed for dealing with future challenges. And we saw that with the global pandemic, but you see it time and again. And Peter Laslett, who I think I used to come across his name, but he's a fantastic Locke scholar, he's a very influential Locke scholar. But he said in a paper published about 2 decades ago, that existing political institutions are kind of obsolescent, because they're just not well designed for problems which are global in reach and intergenerational. And so one thing you might think we owe future generations then is, well, we need to think about whether political institutions can be reformed to make them better at dealing with problems that are global and intergenerational. Because you can have marvelous principles and fantastic policies, but if the institutions are mal-designed, they're not going to ever get adopted. They're not really the hearing. So, yeah, but the first thought really is that our institutions are not designed for this. And I suppose the second thought is there are ways of designing institutions that might improve on what we've got so far. Now, I mean, one problem, thinking about it from the point of view of intergenerational justice, one problem with these institutions is they're very presentist, they're very short term. And this is the subject of one of the books mentioned earlier. And I think if we're going to think about, do we have duties to reform institutions? We need to think about why they're really bad at governing with long-term problems. And here in a very abstract way, I want to identify 4 factors that make it really hard for institutions to govern well for the long term. Each of which, the big literature behind, each of which is quite controversial. But here goes. So one factor you might think that makes it really hard is human psychology and social norms and practices. They tend to be very presentist. So economists talk about the discount rates that individuals operate with, and most people do that within our own lives, and we do it across lives as well. But getting people to care about people now is quite hard, but getting them to care about people 2 centuries down the road is going to be extremely hard. So that's what I mean by motivational limitations. Cognitive biases, people find it very hard to assess the probabilities and the magnitude of the effects the further they are in the future. In fact, I mean, there's a discussion of this in Plato's Protagoras, when he explains why people are acratic. And one is he thinks that things that are further in the future look smaller. I don't think he's quite right about that, but that's a cognitive bias. And there are loads of cognitive biases. People are really bad at detecting what Michael Glantz called creeping problems. Grow, change incrementally. We don't really notice the difference. So I just think there are features of human psychology, but also human societies that are often quite present. Existing political institutions are often designed in ways that incentivize the short term. Budget cycles or 24-hour news cycles, or I don't know what like here, but in the UK, you have frequent cabinet turnover when the Prime Minister wants to reassert authority, he or she sacks someone. And so in the last 6 years, we've lost track of how many ministers for education you have or ministers for health. It's impossible to govern for the long term if someone's in office for about 6 months to a year. There's, of course, the electoral cycle, and then there's sort of state capacity. Lots of institutions have been captured by sectional interests and are ill-equipped then to govern for the long term. And then here's a third factor that makes it really hard to do justice to future generations, which is what economists have called credible commitment problems. So someone might think, why? Suppose I want to persuade you all to do something now, which I want you to do in the future. And I say, I will do it. And you say, well, we haven't got a credible commitment that you will. And that's because the future is kind of open. And standard solution to this is the Jon Elster type Ulysses and the Sirens. You won't find yourself. And that's what Thomas Schelling talks about. But then there are ethical problems there. Is it appropriate for one generation to bind others? And what is it even possible? I remember when Barack Obama passed some climate legislation, he said, oh, the next guy is going to be able to undo it all. That's what happened. So the open nature of the future, we have like an intergenerational collective action problem. And then the fourth factor is, if you want to protect your interests, the one prerequisite is being alive and being able to do it, to campaign, to vote, to protest, to be able to eject people from office. But future people can't do that, right? They have to live with the world that they inherit. So they're inherently vulnerable. So if we're thinking about what duties do we owe to future generations, or climate duties? I think one thing we have to think about is, are there ways of mitigating some of these so that they don't mean the voice of thinkers and marginalised from political discourse? And I'm not going to try and persuade anyone of any particular proposals, but I want to flag up there are ways that I and others have before thinking about how you might try and change things. So, for example, some people will campaign for there to be a legislative committee for the future to make sure that the future is not squeezed out from the present, or building in deliberating about the future into the parliamentary agenda. And the thought there is it'll just get squeezed out. If we just have politics as normal, these issues will not appear unless we have artifices that design to include the future in the present day. Well, the third one is really what I have in my mind is American political science who work on climate politics in the US, like Matthew Mildenberger and Leah Stokes, who chronicle the way that fossil fuel corporations recaptured some institutions. And so if you want to govern well for the future, you need to kind of keep those barriers in existence so that you're not dependent on powerful actors with short-term interest. The fourth one, I must admit, is informed by events in the UK, where lots of infrastructure is not owned by the state, it's given to asset managers. And there's people like Brett Christophers have persuasively chronicled. They're of course concerned with their short-term profit margins, so they don't invest for the long term. So there's a mismatch between what's necessary, which is being a steward for these institutions for the long term, and the mechanism used, which is to assign it to an agent with short-term profit margins. So I want to include some of these because someone might think, I have no idea how could we possibly make our systems more equipped to deal with the future. Those are some thoughts. And then someone might think, well, what about the global level, right? We need the global level to think about these. And one thing that's really interesting is the current Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, is powerfully committed to reforming transnational institutions to better protect the future of the world. I mean, he wrote this report, or his team presumably, on our common agenda, which is full of suggestions for how to redesign the UN and other bodies to make them more future sensitive. And he hosted this event in September this year. So what might you do? Well, in Glasgow, when there was a climate conference there a couple of years ago, some people set up a global citizens assembly of randomly selected citizens, and a network that's going to create a network of others. And their thought was, these negotiations are dominated by powerful states, and they often have fossil fuel company representatives present there. What you really need are political actors here who don't have those incentives, right? They are not dependent on getting re-elected. They're not dependent on money from fossil fuel companies. And so they can serve as some kind of accountability check. Francis Stewart has said, look, you should mainstream the future into all UN operations, and for all of them, you should have a representative future generations. Just because of factor 4 earlier, they can't defend themselves. If you think about those who are powerless to protect themselves, we can create guardians, like maybe a guardian for a small child, or a guardian for non-human animals. And why can't you have a guardian for future generations? So you can read the others. The point there is, I suppose, to get us to think, if we have climate duties to future generations, then and any current institutions have a great impact on whether we realise them or not. We can't duck the question of how we ought to design political institutions. Okay, so that brings us to the end. So if someone asks what climate duties do we owe future generations, I'll give you 3 parts of one bigger answer. And I think the animating idea that we should adopt comes from Brian Barry, saying we should think of ourselves as custodians rather than owners of the planet. That's what those institutional reforms ideally would do. They would get us to think it's not ours to destroy or undermine or corrode. It's something that might be owned in common through all generations. And there's a ways of that idea of custodianship. And then this links to the next two, because someone might think, how do we get there? And whose job is it to get there? And that's where the next two lectures come in. Oh, that's some self-promotion.
We'll have some. Merci beaucoup. On va avoir maintenant un commentaire par Éric Pinault. We'll have commentary by Éric Pinault. Éric Pinault est professeur au département de sociologie, membre de l'Institut des sciences de l'environnement, qui est ceux qui à l'UQAM, il est aussi professeur de la chaire de recherche UQAM en transition écologique et directeur scientifique du Pôle sur la ville résiliente. Il a travaillé sur les impacts structuraux de l'économie et des politiques de qualité. Il a aussi étudié le développement de l'industrie, belle industrie des sables bitumineux au Canada. Il s'intéresse au métabolisme social, à l'économie écologique. Et il mène aussi tout particulièrement des recherches sur la transition énergétique ici au Québec dans une perspective de décroissance. Qu'est-ce qu'il a à nous dire? Je redis en anglais rapidement. So Eric Pinault is professor in sociology. He's a member of the Environmental Sciences Institute at UQAM. He's also a research associate at the Institute on Ecological Transition, and he's scientific director of the Pôle sur la ville résiliente. So Eric Pinault has worked on the structural and macroeconomic impacts of austerity policies. He's also studied the development of the oil sands industry in Canada. His research interests include social metabolism and ecological economics, and he's conducting research on the energy transition in Quebec from a degrowth perspective. So let's see his comments.
Yeah. Thank you for the great lecture, and thank you for having me. So a few quick comments with no PowerPoint addition, because I wanted to be able to react live. But the notes are the lecture is very close to the notes that I was sent. I'm going to discuss the two first points of the talk. The last part, I guess, I feel less equipped, though I might have a few comments. I want to start by saying from where I'm speaking from. Well, I got a small bio read out. Important to note that I'm not a philosopher. I'm somebody that does empirical work in the empirical sciences, and that's going to impact the way I'm going to react. So I'm going to meet you on the terrain of how, as an empirical scientist, can I nourish or contest some of the work that is being presented from my point of view. I don't want to engage on the philosophical terrain because I don't feel legitimate or equipped to do that. That's an important caveat. And then maybe another two other little biographical notes that are important for what I'm about to say. I work in the environmental sciences, which have gone through an important technological revolution in the last 40 years that maybe problematize or maybe trouble a bit the framework, the a priori framework you're in. And I want to see how that resonates with what you're going to present. The way we understand the planet has radically changed, and the way we understand knowledge and work, basic knowledge categories, in the IPBS in particular, if you've the International Panel on Biodiversity and Services, but also at the IPCC. And I'll try to see how that resonates. The other thing is I work on capitalism. And that kind of changes a lot of things when you work on capitalism instead of the economy. Growth really has another, it emerges as a different reality. And I want to see how that resonates. So let's start with the first aspect, the framing. The framing, like most interventions on sustainability and on transition today, outside of the environmental sciences, and that's really important, the framing is one that is directly in the climate issue and carbon cycle, and that's something that is less and less the way we look at the environmental crisis and the environmental sciences for I would say, social and also for biophysical reasons, the climate, the way we understand it, is bundled into, or hardwired would be the better expression, into wider planetary processes, biogeochemical processes, which we now understand well. We can understand the planet as a totality, as a biophysical system that works as a totality. I'm thinking of the work, that's coming out of Earth system sciences. And the climate is strongly coupled with biodiversity, which then changes the questions we start to ask. And one of the first questions that we ask, but maybe it's not, doesn't come out in philosophy, is we can't, human flourishing for us is insufficient. We talk about the flourishing of all life forms as an a priori. We can't have as a baseline the standard of living of future humans. We tend in environmental sciences today to start from the flourishing of life as our basic category and then work from there for two reasons. One, the ecologists will tell us, well, you can't have humans without other. So you can come back to an anthropocentric perspective saying, it's an instrumental reason why we need these other living beings. So that can be dealt with. But then you'll have other people, and this is especially strong in the IPBS community, that will say, well, that's your ontology. From a pluriversal perspective, other ontologies will not separate humans outside of outside of what we call nature. And thus your concept of flourishing has to be much wider. So how do you work with that? Because then you're not just working with future generations, but you're working with future states of the planet or future living generations, including other. So I'm just wondering, how would that impact the construction? And it's a really an open question. I don't have, that's a first. The second thing that I think, and again, this is empirical. The things that I'm saying now are very empirical. Is the framework you've presented us is a framework built around the problem of mitigation, and future generations have to bear the cost of either what we've mitigated or the cost of what we haven't mitigated, right? And then that's how we work through the cost curve. But today, and this is why I work at the Resilient Cities Center, we also have to look at adaptation. So we have to look at resilience. What we're doing today will decide not only how much carbon they will be able to spend, but it also, what we're doing today is going to decide how resilient they will be in that changed world that will exist in a changed state that is unknown. So the more so there's a dual, I would say dual challenge, the challenge of mitigation and the challenge of adaptation to a changed world. And we know that, speak a bit about why degrowth might be relevant, or another word, post-growth is usually what I use, having adopted this in Germany, where they say post-Wachstum, they can't say it in Germany. High energy intensive, material intensive systems are very unresilient. Right? Whereas more passive, less intensive in materials and energy systems, less complex systems, social systems tend to be more resilient. That's just like a basic thing. So it's an empirical. So how would adaptation work? And I think it probably works well, but it's a different set of questions. Because when you're talking about adaptation, you're talking about maybe, and some people argue this, sacrifices today so that future societies cannot be flourishing, but can exist, right? And that's a harder question than this question of standard of living, existence. And that's maybe the third aspect before I move on to the growth question, which I think is really important. The third aspect is that in the universe, in the epistemic universe I tend to be in, we talk about an existential crisis. We're not talking about standards of living. We're not talking about how well we'll be. We're talking about the condition of possibility of future human beings. Will there be future generations? We talk about, in French, habitabilité, la terre, habitability of the earth. And one answer, which is, and I'd really like to have philosophers answer this for me, but one answer is Rockstrom's answer, actually Rockstrom et al., their planetary boundaries paper, where they actually say the Holocene is our normative framework. It's our, if the planet moves away from the Holocene conditions, then we have to move it back in. It's really weird, because then you could actually geoengineer the planet if it was going into glacial age to bring it back into anything. But it's interesting to see that the Holocene is transformed into a normative standard. But this standard for them is one of the condition of possibility of social life and not of flourishing a human standard of living. So when we move the question to that, how does that, how does that create these intergenerational and intragenerational arbitrations? Okay, now I'm going to move to the question of growth. I guess I got about 7 minutes. Yeah, good. Okay, great. Okay, I'm just going to go through minutes to make sure that I'm doing it in the right way. For me, growth is an empirical fact. Maybe it's because I'm an empirical fact that has 3 guises. I sent you a paper. I worked on it a bit. And I think that if we look at growth more in these 3 guises, then it can be interesting to yeah. Of course, the GDP thing, right? And what are the GDP what does the GDP measure? It basically measures the output and the development of what we call a monetary production economy. But there are 2 other figures of growth, I think, that are really strong in our society. One is growth as an ideology, which is really which is a modernist ideology that ties together time, history, progress. All these are bundled together with this idea of growth. And I think when you attack growth, that really comes up quickly. People will say quickly, you're bringing us back to the carts and to the candles. So when that's because you're touching something. And then the other, and that's more bringing you on my terrain, the other aspect of growth is social metabolism. I can measure growth in tons of matter extracted, tons of matter dissipated, per capita per year, per region, trades in between material trade. I can measure it in hectares transformed, the degree of artificialization. Sorry, I'm used to saying this in French. It's like that word you're trying to say. It's the tonic accent that's always moving from one language to another. So yeah, of ecosystems needed so that we can produce the biomass that we transform and I can look at it as energy. So this is an empirical thing that I can measure, and that we know has to shrink. I mean, that thing has to shrink. And then the other empirical question that is much debated is the decoupling question. So the decoupling question, I have an answer to the decoupling question, which is that I need capitalism to answer it. See, if I'm just talking about an economy, then I can think of an economy that is decoupled from growth. Because growth is, as you say, an epiphenomenon. And I actually agree that growth is an epiphenomenon. I'll talk about degrowth in a minute. It is an epiphenomenon. What's behind growth? Accumulation, for me. Because I have a capitalist economy. I don't only have an economy. And this capitalist economy, of course, is not just, capitalism and capitalist social relations do not infuse the whole structure of the economy, but it is the core component and it is the driving factor. And if you look at it that way, then growth is an imperative that comes out of accumulation. And how does accumulation work? And that bring capitalism in to the debate. What does it do? And that's what I did in a paper with some colleagues that earlier. It does for me 3 things that are interesting to your work, for me, I think. I'm trying to find my notes here to get those 3 things and I'll run. Yeah, the growth imperative. Because capital must be accumulated, and that's the expansionary nature of capitalist economies. That's the first. The second thing that capitalism can bring into this discussion, capitalism is about private investment. And what is private investment? Private investment is deciding today what the future will be over a 30-year, 40-year period. And in our society, and for the last 200 years, that power has been monopolized by individuals or complex organizations we call private sector corporations. Sometimes states are involved, but massively it's the private sector in function of their orientations, their interests, their worldviews that are responsible for investment decisions, which once again, and I like the concept in institutional economics, in the old institutional economists, comments. And Veblen, how did they call investment? They called it futurity. It was a great word, maturity. That's what investment does. So capitalism tells us that investment is driven by the accumulation motive, and it's a process that is in the hands of large, powerful, monopolistic private sector actors that do have very long-term visions of their own survival and their own expansion. Right? And the third thing that capitalism brings us is the idea of a society that is not symmetric. We don't have a symmetric plane. We have asymmetries that are structural and that are entrenched. These can be class-based, they can be center-periphery, they can be gender or colonial. And this troubles the way we look at the way institutions work because we have these entrenched. So inequality is not an outcome. Inequality is a driving force in our system. Very different from the more progressive liberal critique, which says inequality is a bad thing because it's a result. For us, inequality is an entrenched structural determination, which is prior. And that really changes the way then you look at institutions, but that's a problem that I'd leave to you. I don't have an answer to these. Okay, the last thing about degrowth, and then I'll conclude. 2 minutes, great. I agree that it's a horrible word, actually. But it was really it was really useful and it's still useful. Because it attacks. It's you know, that was the whole argument of the French were saying it's a mot missile, right? It's a word that breaks the obvious nature of growth. But it's not a positive word. It has no, I mean, it's just negative. So the D can be thought of as something that breaks the status quo, that opens a space for discussion. But as you said, it also pushes back. The D also means descent, means the metabolic descent. That's something that we are faced with. And I think that especially the richest among us and the richest nations are faced with a metabolic descent. And that is going to be a very challenging process. So I agree. And then what can, that it's a bad word, what's the positive word? And you use it at the very beginning, and I want to end with this, and it's sufficiency. I think that and the work on what is a sufficient economy and sufficiency as a principle has been really flourishing in the past 20 years. And most of the people in degrowth actually write on suffisance or sufficiency. And I'm thinking of the people in Barcelona, the people in Vienna, you work with people in Leeds also, O'Neill, and all this. So sufficiency has been given a much stronger, I think, definition than the one in Brundtland, which was actually very weak. And actually, in the 70s, we had a stronger notion of sufficiency because we worked with limits. And precisely the job of Brundtland was to get rid of the link between sufficiency and limits, and to start thinking of sufficiency as an open-ended, so sufficiency plus resilience and limits are, I think, important concepts positive concepts that we can bring forth, or at least that I bring forth in my work in the empirical sciences of the environment. And I'm wondering how they would resonate. Yeah, and I think I'll stop there. Oh, Rich Christophers will be here at the end of the month at UCAM, by the way. Yeah.
That's your response?
5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A huge amount and a lot to think about. I'm going to so that people can ask questions or give answers. And so 4 things, and I will stop. So, yeah. So you're absolutely right, of course, that these environmental processes should be, and in reality are, bundled together. And it's hard because, I mean, I've argued rigorously for exactly that in philosophy. If people have a tendency to isolate a topic and say, I'm going to write about climate, or I'm going to write about health, or I'm going to write about migration or trade. And I think, no, you can't do that because they're A, causally so interconnected, and B, normatively, they raise similar and related issues. But it's quite hard then to do anything without thinking, okay, the way I think about it is imagine a map with all of these things interconnected and you think, well, which bit am I going to peer out and focus on? And I think I'm going to peer out and focus on the climate bit, but from a different angle, I think all of these links with biodiversity. So I suppose it's just a reminder to me and everyone else that, yeah, we should do exactly what you say and regard all of these processes as deeply causally intertwined. But it's a bit like when you're building something, you can't think, oh, there's 100 items in this IKEA furniture I've got to make. You've got to think, I'm going to connect this bit and that bit first, and that's where I'm going to devote my attention first. And so it's agreement, but explaining why I thought I'd drill down on the climate bit. But as soon as you deal with climate, you will find there'll be ripple effects for everything. So someone goes, oh, let's put sulfur particles in the atmosphere, and then people worry about the ozone layer, or they think, let's use nuclear energy, and then there's other implications. So yeah, it can never be isolated. Agreement. Yeah, I think maybe second point, maybe it was very mitigation centric, but I don't know. But I think everything I say should apply to adaptation. So in terms of leaving the world better off in the future or can cope. So I'm in a politics department. The first thing I think of there is having resilient institutions that can cope well with these challenges, and having functioning institutions is one thing we need to target. So yeah, you're absolutely right, obviously, to mention adaptation. Maybe I should have mentioned it more, but I think it fits in with the framework of how I think of it. And then the third thing you talked about, is it really about human flourishing or is it an existential crisis? And I thought, at the risk of sounding contradictory, it can be both, right? But I think philosophically, what's really interesting to me is to think about what the ingredients of a good life are, and then to think, what are their environmental preconditions? And there are people, aware of who work a lot on this. And what I find interesting is that many of the things we most value don't, I think, have heavy demands on the world. So love, friendship, functioning institutions. So, you know, being in a workplace where you're treated with respect on terms of equality, or being in one where you're harassed or bullied, it can be identical in terms of the footprint. And so I think part of a good life is very Rawlsian, the social basis of self-respect, and also to be treated with respect. But those things like love, friendship, family, social relations in terms of equality, they're all kind of in the NUSBAM list. Yeah. They don't require huge demands on the natural world. I mean, the practice of being a family member in our modern world might do, because people might think, you don't love me unless you give me, and then some item, but it doesn't have to be done that way. So I think lots of these really important goods of human life and human flourishing can be achieved and realized without these huge environmental demands. So that's why it can be potential existential crisis, because it's going up and up. At the same time, there's genuine prospects for flourishing, and it's not as dichotomous, I think, as one might think. But that's my pitch. And then there's so many other things that you said I'd like to ask more about, but let me just say something about capitalism, which was conspicuously absent from my talk, and deliberately so, because I thought it's just too mammoth. I'm just going to say three kind of things very bluntly on capitalism. So it might be true that growth is an imperative of capitalism, but I suppose my worry is that any system will not cope well with following facts. So there's just way more coal and oil underground that's accessible than it would be healthy for the planet to extract. So I think in any system where people are not perfectly saintly and they want material possessions, all of this stuff under the ground, they're going to extract it. So maybe that they don't have the same drive as capitalist system does. But I don't, I suppose I can't see how this problem would be resolved unless there's a transformation of human nature that I don't think can be offing. So one is, if capitalism's bad, won't other systems be similar, not similarly bad, but just very bad? The second one, just to link to Brett Christopher's, what I found really interesting about his book on the price is wrong, which you will understand it much more than I do, but the bottom line of it was, people keep saying that renewable energy is getting cheaper, But he says that's irrelevant really, because for the firms, they're not making a profit on it. But then he said there is a kind of a contradiction between capitalism and climate, but it's contingently so. If it were the case that renewables would be profitable, then there wouldn't be this contradiction. And I think that seems very plausible. That seems fascinating then, that the contradiction exists contingently. And then I think that the really big issue for me as not an expert in this domain is the role of the state. Is it possible to create political action and political movements in the state that could tame the market and could, incentivize or people to engage in renewables, which does take place in some countries like Germany, even if maybe not we need. So it seems to me as a political philosopher reading political economy of this, the really big thing I want to know, which I guess has always been an issue in Marxism and people like Edward Bernstein was, or Polanyi for that matter, is could you get a political actor that would be sufficiently powerful to be able to tame these effects? I do not know the answer to that, but I suppose what I think is that's where the action is in terms of thinking, can capitalism cope with climate change, which I thought was the gist of the final sort of comment. I'll stop there. Thanks so much again.
You need to stay here. Need you to answer the question.
Maybe.
Well, we have people on Zoom also. So for those of you on Zoom, please raise your hands on Zoom and I'll monitor the questions from here. And I'll monitor the questions here. So I'll take the turns here. Okay.
And we'll alternate. So, on va prendre les questions à la fois dans la salle et sur Zoom. Bon, allez-y, les questions sont ouvertes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I wonder to what extent we should understand what you're saying about to future generations, literally rather than metaphorically. Because metaphorically it makes perfect sense to say that we somehow owe to future generations stuff and that we need to preserve the planet and so on. But if we take it strictly, then do these duties imply rights from future generations? And how many generations would have those rights? Right holders of, and generations that are demographically how big? Because if at some point the 30th generation has an amount, a demography that is incompatible with living in a small planet, then if we apply your standard, we should, there's no way for us to make, there's no rational or sensible way for us to even try to have them living at least as well off or whatever. So are there, and that's so, how many generations are the right holders? Are those generations, there's a limit to the number of people that are in generations? And who can enforce those rights? Because rights that cannot be enforced, to me, look like metaphorical rights, not real rights.
Thank you. So, yeah, lots of questions there. So I suppose one thing just to say at the start is it's quite possible to think that there are duties but no correlative rights. You might think that we can have a language of justice and what people ought to do without affirming there are rights the other side of it. So many of our duties are not grounded in right. But I do think future people have rights, and the way I think we think about this, the way put forward by Feinberg, but lots of others have subsequently said, people worry about the metaphysics. How can you, a non-existent entity, have a right? And you say, and there's someone called Robert Elliott, I'm not sure if I'm remembering his first name right, who said, you could say that they have rights right now, even though they don't exist. But you could also just say that when they exist, they will have rights. Because when they exist, they will have rights. That generates duties that go in time. I mean, otherwise we would lead to quite absurd conclusions. So imagine someone building, not going to be a nice example. Imagine someone building a primary school. They're building it before children are born. And they're negligent, they're dangerous. And then like 15 years later, when the children who weren't born when they built it are alive, it's a horrible accident and they get crushed. And someone says, well, so you didn't have any duties to those children because they weren't alive then. I think, you know, no one would think that lets them off the hook. You think they will have those rights not to be crushed to death by negligent building.
Grenfell Tower.
Yeah, exactly. And so otherwise you could get two events in time, one of which you built it when they were alive and it collapsed, another one they built it before they were born and then they. So I just think that's a useful way that Robert Elliott thinks about it. And I think Feinberg kind of had a similar thought beforehand. So they will have rights, and in virtue of that, there will be duties that follow down to us. But then you say, well, yeah, how far in the future? And that is an interesting, hard question, I think. What I've argued in print, so I'm not sure if I think it's true, but maybe is partly how far it is depends on your causal reach throughout time. So let's take Finland, and there's an island called Oiku, where they were building underground to store nuclear waste, and they're trying to design it to last. Actually, they have different scenarios. There's a fantastic book by an anthropologist on the ways they're thinking about the future there, and some of them are doing for 100,000 years, and they're wondering how can you write signs on it that people in 100,000 years might be able to understand. So the link with this is then I think they are doing the right thing. It would be negligent to think there's this process that could last for 100,000 years, but we're only going to look like 25 years or 100 years ahead because the causal reach is that far. But there are other things where the causal reach is just much more intermittent and shaky. So to refer to Rawls, Rawls has this peculiar thing in the theory of justice where he says people would look 2 generations ahead. And one hypothesis is put forward by Barry, that he was thinking about things like the welfare state and investments, and he kind of thought, you know, you could maybe foresee what would likely happen 2 generations ahead by some macroeconomic policy now. But if you say, I really care about healthcare, people like in 1,000 years' time, so we're going to invest in our welfare state now, that'd be ludicrous because there just isn't the same kind of causal reach. And so the answer really is, for the problem you're looking at, what's the causal action? And for things like nuclear waste, I think you really need to think about generations for hundreds of thousands of years. But for other things, it might be much shorter because the nature of the problem doesn't have quite as long a ripple throughout time. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how I currently think about it.
Yes, I really enjoyed the exchange with Eric, and I think we'll come back a little bit to capitalism tomorrow. But what I wanted to suggest now is a little maybe friendly amendment to the question about mitigation and adaptation. I mean, you had a lot to say about institutions and designing political institutions such that they are more responsive to the needs of future generations. I know when we talk about adaptation in the context of climate change, then we usually have infrastructural things in mind. You know, we need to adapt our infrastructure so it can withstand, you know, the wildfires and the sea level rise and the hurricanes and so on. But it also affects political institutions. So I thought that maybe one answer to Eric could have been on your part. Well, I am talking about adaptation there. It's political adaptation, not infrastructure, but in a way that is also infrastructure, infrastructure that responds to climate change to make our societies more resilient and be oriented towards future generations that are affected by climate change.
Yes, I think one disservice we do to future generations is believe them dysfunctional political institutions that are not accountable and that can't go to the challenges. Yeah. I agree.
Thank you for the lecture of your rulings. I have a question about the grounds of duty. So, if you're interested in fulfilling the interests of human beings as a species, then does it have, if that is the ground, then does it have any implications for fulfilling interests of other non-human species?
Let's repeat the question so that, yes.
Parce que c'était pas si assez fort.
Ouais.
You repeat louder.
I wonder what the grounds of duties are.
Yeah.
If it is the interests of human beings as a species, and fulfilling it, that gives rise to duties, then do we have duties for non-human animals as well?
Yeah. Well, my short answer is yes. And actually in slides tomorrow, I'm not editing it tonight to adjust it, non-human animals feature. It's something that Eric also asked about this. Yeah. So the short answer is yes, and the longer answer would give you an account of what grounds the claims of non-human animals. And I do think interests matter, interests in life and not suffering. And so the same reasons that apply to human animals, I think, generate certain rights for non-human animals. I suppose the reason I didn't mention it is I thought, and I think this frequently, we've got a whole load of controversial ideas in here. We've got another controversial idea, but maybe I should just report it as, I mean, that's what I do in my book. I just say, I'm not going to really argue for it, but I'm assuming non-human animals have moral status, I think that's to be respected and included. Yes, I suppose, and I think it's just hard not to think that, given certain of the reasons I think that human beings have moral status. It will come up a bit tomorrow in lecture 2 because I talk about how we should achieve a just transition, and one thing is respecting the value of the natural world and the claims of non-human animals. But just to warn anyone, I don't have a fully developed moral theory that deals with that. Yeah, phrasing that.
Yes, thank you for the lecture. I'll try to be as clear as possible with the English. So my question is more of a remark on the third part of your lecture, and it kind of relate a bit with adaptation and everything. So it seems like to me, like climate change itself specifically commend short-termism in the form of the adaptation imperative that it is imposing on society and political institutions. So there's a crisis now that challenge our possibilities of existence, and politics will more and more have the imperative to react to different kind of natural occurrences of climate change, and by so to put a lot of their social, political, and economic resources to adapt against and mitigate their very present and immediate effects. However, as you said in the third section of your lecture, intergenerational justice implies a relation towards the long term, and political institutions often fail to do so for various reasons. This is where I don't see how, in addition of the 4 factor that you noted, we could also overcome this injunction to put our resources on short-term problems that climate change crisis seems to put us in. So considering that, would you agree that there seems to be a tension between the short-termism that adaptation to climate change impose on society and the long-term policies that intergenerational justice require? And if so, how would you think we could overcome this tension, or how adaptation could fit more precisely in your framework?
So let me just let me try and understand it right. So under the current state of affairs, there's a imperative to adapt, and that's just like there's a sort of short-term goal that needs to be met. At the same time, we want to think about the long-term, mitigating the long-term as well as the long-term, and how do we negotiate those tensions? Yeah. So let me think about that. I think one thing that's come to mind as you were talking, or two things from time. One is that focusing on the short term is not always the wrong thing to do. So, in Florida at the moment, it's totally political authorities focus on that. But there are different ways of doing it, and there are ways of doing it that might be sticking plaster on it, or dealing it in a very short-term way. And there are ways of doing it that think more about the long-term effect. And so I think focusing on short-term is sometimes absolutely justified. But when we do it, we don't have to neglect the long-term in doing it. And I suppose the second thing is the trick partly is to find ways in which the two are mutually compatible. And actually, I do think that's frequently the case. So I can't think of an adaptation related one, but think, for example, about one of the diagnoses of short-term. So it says political institutions are being captured by sectional interest of short fossil fuel companies. I think if we're concerned about the short term and the long term, we would want to eradicate that. Because in the short term, it corrupts and makes a mockery of the idea of democracy. In the long term, it's also good because we're no longer beholden to actors with short time horizons. Well, here's some other cases. So often when people write about short-termism, they take the motivations of citizens as being short-sighted and immutable. But most of the psychological and economic literature on time horizons, so people are very responsive to, are they living in poverty? Are they living in instability and chaos? Is there uncertainty? And the more people are facing poverty and uncertainty, the more short-termist are their horizons, and understandably. So it seems to me there's a win-win kind of approach, which is to say one thing is owed to them are economies which are not characterized by poverty, not characterized by massive uncertainty as to whether you keep yourself and your family, plans for the future, and not riven apart by uncertainty. And it turns out if you do that, it also benefits the long term. So, yeah, I don't think there's so much of a tension. Maybe there will be some cases, and maybe I'll just add with one that I'm not sure about, but I'll mention it as a possible thought. So, just to pick up one thing, is instead of a democracy. There's some quite interesting work by Johannes Lindvall, who's a political scientist, on how power sharing systems are much better at governing for the long term. Essentially, parties are willing to make unpopular decisions because they know that they're going to be in power in the future. And so it's not electorally catastrophic. So his thesis was that power sharing institutions good at governing for the long term. But it says they're less good at governing with short-term crises. And so then you might have this tension, if he's right, that you either have to choose ones where there's not power sharing and it's basically one party wins, like the UK, one party wins for a period and then it just loses power and then it swings to another party. And that might be better at coping with short-term challenges. But the UK is not a good advert for that. Or you can have a proportional one. So that worries me if he's right about that, because that would be an instantiation of that kind of tension. You're right to raise. It's certainly possible. And
Well, thank you for the very thoughtful and interesting lecture. I want to press you a bit to answer a bit closer to the arguments proposed by Hugues Leblanc, but I'm sure you reserved a lot of material for session 2 and 3, and we're going to get more of that in the coming day. But let's get a predate of it. So my question would be, if we take seriously the asymmetries and inequalities, not as being a byproduct, an effect, or being sad and unfathomable distribution, we get formal normative and justice theory, but we think of it empirically as being a structural marker of capitalism. And then we kind of end up with a bit earlier answer you gave, which reminds a bit of jokingly, but Winston Churchill, when it was like, capitalism, of course, is bad, but it's the least worst of all systems. So if it is a driving force and a motor, how we can attain that force? Of course, we need a strong political actors. many political theorists are making the claim that we need something that will be beyond nation state level. And we will need world politics. Famously, for example, Matthew Patterson was writing in Search of a Climate Politics that we need to design new political institutions beyond merely correcting existing institutions. So what could look an institution, of course, everybody thinks of mechanism, which you have worked on, and like the rock construction, but like what could we have as like super nation state institutions that could face like driving forces?
No, it's a good question. It's a really hard question. There's one thing I just want to put on the table is that the way that lots of political scientists have analysed climate policy. But just as a background to this, when people started working on climate change, economists were very quick off them. Political scientists were a bit slow, but and then they started writing a lot in the last decade. And so there's one interesting line of argument that very many of them hold, which is to say, in one sense, it's a global problem, but in another sense, it isn't. So the sense in which what they really, some of them, I should name names. So Matthew Mildenberg is one, Michael Acklin is another, Colgan, Jessica Green, and Tom Hale, for example. What they say is, if you read economists, orthodox economists, they will say, oh, it's a global collective action problem. Why should we mitigate it with one country if China doesn't? And lots of philosophers have written like that, but they say this is the wrong picture. It's the wrong picture entirely because there are distributive conflicts within each country. And what they say is, if you look within any country, there are people who win from a green energy transition, and there are people who will lose from it. And the people who would lose are very powerful, very concerted energy, and so far been very successful, including persuading everyone else that, oh, it'd be terrible and costly, and why should we do it? And it keeps building power plants. So I do talk a little bit about this tomorrow, but I'm just rehearsing what some of them say. It's not relevant to me. But then this makes me think it's not that we need a new global institution. We do need to improve global institutions, and I'll say why in a minute. But if we had to wait for there to be a better global one and overcome capitalism to solve it, then despair should reign the land. But I'm saying I don't, if this analysis is right, then it's possible, for example, to get Green New Deal or green energy transition by building coalitions with people who are concerned about people dying from poor air quality, and they want green jobs and they want energy security, and they might not want people extracting fossil fuels on their land and transporting it, thinking about indigenous peoples. And so if all that's true, then we don't need the global or the mitigation point of view. I'm just putting that out there as a hypothesis. This gives me some reasons for hope, thinking, oh, we don't have to do all of that. But people from the global south often say in discussions of climate, oh, no, those global COP negotiations are invaluable, not because they ever make any binding agreement. The binding agreements in certain countries, Canada, will opt out, did opt out, and the US opted out. So it's not about that, but it's a forum where they can express their views on, for example, loss and damage, climate finance, transfer of clean energy. And I think, yeah, if we didn't have global conferences, those things would never get discussed in other countries. And so I think there are ways of improving that to make sure that those get better on. So I think banning corporations from taking part in negotiations and being there would be a step forward. Having global citizens' assemblies where people throughout the world are represented and could talk about how it's affecting them, that would improve that. Having public justification where when they reach a text, they should be able to, they should read it out to people in Bangladesh or and say, this is what we're agreeing to, and this is its implications for you. That might improve it. But anything other than that, I don't know. So I'm just throwing out ideas of things that I would, and I do think there's a sort of a general dilemma that the more you think there's nothing to the teeth or things that can happen, you'll get fewer people participating in it. So I think August Scott Barrett, who's so there's always this tension between wide participation and binding rules. You can go for binding rules, but then they're not going to participate. Or you can have wide participation by all states in the world, but then they're really going to vote for being constrained, unlikely. So I realize it's a bit of a ramble, but the main point is, to what extent is it really actually a global institutional problem? And some thoughts on ways you might improve the global data as it is in a very non-utopian, imperfect way. But maybe we could talk sometime, you could tell me what you think on the answers to that.
Yeah, I already spoke. If there's someone else, please let them go for it.
Okay, you.
Yes, thank you very much. My question is actually very much related to the previous question. I found very interesting your remark about the we and the future generations, and also the remarks about not only the vertical but also the horizontal inequalities between societies. And I was thinking about how this applies to the present. And when we ask about the duties that we have, what are the agents that we are talking about? Is it individuals? Is it states? And then is it all states, all individuals? And if not, are there other agents that might have other duties than the ones that you described?
I'm really hard not to say. That's what I'm going to ask in lecture 3.
Yeah.
Not specifically for intergenerational justice, but for anyone's, because they get a bit frustrated. People are like, it's a really bad thing, and they say, yeah, we ought to bring about some structural change. And I think, well, who's the we, and what structural change is how are you looking about it? So I don't have a quick answer your question. I suppose I do think two kinds of thoughts. One is that I think all agents at all levels, so we could say it's government's responsibilities, but government have not done anything really efficiently up to the task since they've known about it. It's a huge emissions gap, even like the United Nations Environment Programme says. And then I think other powerful actors, they have policy incentives. So what the firms, what the power, but if you're going to wait for firms to do it, and think you're waiting for a long time. So I do think powerful actors have duties to do this, but I think many of them just won't. And then I think leads to the conclusion that citizens have to work together and form collective counterpower with other citizens to make sure that, whether it's the university or the firm, or in my case, those, but also things like pension fund act in a responsible way. So why I said pension fund, because that might seem a bit weird, but UK academic pensions are invested by the USF. You look online at your investor, there's a whole raft of companies. And so
Us too.
Okay.
Don't worry, we're there with you. 100% with you.
So I kind of think academics have duties then to work together to pressurize their universities to divest from these. So it's part of a longer answer, but it's a really important question.
Prioriser ceux qui n'auraient pas posé de questions encore. Donc ici, oui, j'ai deux autres questions. Je ne sais pas si vous voulez. On est un peu dans les dernières minutes, donc faites un signe si vous voulez poser une question.
Well, I'll just go straight to the point to straight up the question, just so I avoid the whole prelim. But you call for policy changes for intergenerational justice, and I wanted to ask you if we assume that policy changes will simultaneously require that we rapidly change our ways of doing pedagogy and determining what matters for generation to inhabit differently. So we just heard the question about universities. How should we reclaim pedagogy for future generations? So just as a way to deepen what you were like slowly talking about.
Yeah, it depends what do you mean by pedagogy. So in fact, what I mean is, I think in the classroom, my ideal is no one would know what I thought. Not a realistic ideal, because you are separate. but I think it doesn't belong in the classroom, but it does belong in other forms of activity that academics and universities take. So pressurizing the university to divest from fossil fuels, pressurizing the university not to use fossil fuels for its energy system. Those are things that matter. Now, there might be other things that you think, oh, but that's not enough. We should do some pedagogical things in terms of, for example, I think maybe other universities in Paris. Charbonnier learned from this online, mandatory for all students module on environmental sustainability. Is that something you were thinking around pedagogy or?
Yes, but also, well, since I'm skipping like a whole part of introduction, but to me, this we talked about existential crisis of the inhabitability or the possibility of humans to keep being on the earth, on the planet. And to me, this raises the question of transmission and also sustainability instinctively. So maybe this was not instinctive to you, but yeah, so it was the question of transmission of ways of living.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I do think it's important ways of living in school and in university. What I was trying away from was in my lectures or classes, trying to get everyone to be on whatever side I think is the correct thing. That's where I believe in kind of a neutrality. But I think let's take schools. So schools always instill certain kinds of values. And for example, in the UK, it's often about training children to be good on the golf market or with a career. And there's nothing about environmental stewardship or responsibility. And it's ironic because in the UK, it used to be citizenship law, but that was really about remembering some political facts about the UK and some kind of values like toleration and respect. So yeah, I'm 100% behind initiatives that their duties to instill certain virtues like environmental sustainability. I also think thinking about the long term should be in that. And I have actually tried to persuade people in my university that we should have a mandatory environmental sustainability module, but I didn't really get anywhere. I didn't persuade any of that. And one kind of rejoinder was that matters, but so do lots of other things. And so is there some reason to single that one out over and above everything else? And I thought that was one. So I don't know if I've given you a glimmer of some of the answers that I have.
Je pense il est 5h30. Je pense qu'on ferait bien d'arrêter là. On a eu beaucoup de matière. Je sais qu'il y avait encore 2 questions ici, mais vous aurez la possibilité de discuter encore avec Simon dehors de cours. Donc, je vais vous inviter à remercier Simon.